My grandmother left me her entire estate, but my cousin thinks he deserves it more. Now he's stalking me and trying to prove I'm mentally unstable so he can contest the will. Yesterday, I caught him breaking into my house to plant fake evidence. I'm Rachel, 26, and I work as a nurse practitioner in Portland. My cousin Marcus, 31, has always been the family golden boy. Star athlete, business degree, married to a lawyer. Meanwhile, I was the quiet bookworm who spent summers reading to our grandmother while everyone else was too busy. Grandma Rose raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 12. Marcus's family lived across town in their perfect suburban house while I grew up in Grandma's tiny apartment above her bookstore. For 14 years, I was Grandma's caregiver, best friend, and business partner. I helped run the bookstore, drove her to doctor appointments, made sure she took her medications. Marcus visited twice a year if we were lucky. When Grandma was diagnosed with dementia 3 years ago, I moved back home to care for her full-time, left my job in Seattle, ended a serious relationship, gave up my entire life because she needed me. Marcus never offered to help, said he was too busy with his real estate business and couldn't afford to take time off, but he had plenty of time for family barbecues where he'd charm everyone with stories about his latest deal. Grandma's condition deteriorated slowly. She'd forget conversations but remember poetry from her childhood perfectly. She'd get confused about dates but could recite entire passages from books we'd read together. During her lucid moments, she'd talk about the will she'd updated, said she wanted to make sure I was taken care of since I'd sacrificed so much. I told her not to worry about it, that I just wanted her comfortable. She passed peacefully last month. I held her hand while she slipped away, surrounded by the books she'd loved so much. Marcus arrived 20 minutes after she died, asking immediately about funeral arrangements and legal documents. The will reading was a disaster. Grandma left me everything: the bookstore, her apartment, her savings, even her car. Marcus got a photo album and her recipe collection. His face went white when the lawyer finished reading. He demanded to see the original will, claiming this version was forged. The lawyer patiently explained that Grandma had updated it 6 months ago with full legal representation. Everything was properly witnessed and notarized. Marcus stormed out, but not before telling me I'd manipulated a confused old woman and stolen his inheritance. He said he was going to fight this and prove I'd taken advantage of someone with dementia. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, my life has become a nightmare of harassment and surveillance. It started with Marcus showing up at the bookstore daily, taking photos and asking customers weird questions. He'd approach regular customers, claiming to be doing research on elder abuse, asked if they'd noticed Grandma seeming confused or if I'd ever pressured her into changing any documents. Then he started following me home, parking across the street from Grandma's apartment where I now lived. I'd see his black BMW at the grocery store, the pharmacy, even outside the grief counseling group I'd joined. When I confronted him, he claimed it was a coincidence, said he had every right to shop where he wanted and drive whatever streets he chose. Technically true, but the pattern was obvious. The harassment escalated when he began calling my workplace, told my supervisor I was dealing with serious family legal issues and might be too unstable to work with patients safely. He contacted my ex-boyfriend in Seattle, claiming I'd had a mental breakdown and asking if I'd ever shown signs of manipulation or deception. Poor Ryan was so confused he called to check if I was okay. Marcus even reached out to my grief counselor pretending to be a concerned family member, said he was worried about my mental state and whether I might be experiencing delusions about Grandma's final wishes. Each incident was plausibly explained away, but together they formed a clear pattern of someone trying to build a case against my mental stability. Someone who understood that, while contests often centered on claims of undue influence. The breaking point came when I found him in Grandma's apartment, supposedly looking for family photos. He had a key, claiming Grandma had given it to him years ago for emergencies. I changed the locks immediately and installed a security system. The cameras captured him trying the new locks repeatedly over the next week, always when he thought I wasn't home. Then I discovered he'd been accessing Grandma's medical records illegally. His wife worked at the medical practice, and they'd been pulling files to look for evidence of cognitive decline during the period when she updated her will. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money. Marcus genuinely believed he deserved the inheritance more than me. In his mind, being the successful businessman made him the rightful heir. He'd always resented that Grandma preferred spending time with me. During family gatherings, he'd make snide comments about how I was just sucking up to get into the will. Now he was determined to prove that's exactly what had happened. He needed me to be the villain in a story where he was the wronged grandson fighting for justice against a manipulative caregiver. The evidence planting started small. I'd find things in the apartment that didn't belong there. Legal documents about elder abuse, printouts about dementia and decision-making capacity, books about inheritance fraud, all placed where I'd be sure to discover them, then photographed as evidence of my guilty conscience. Marcus was creating a paper trail, suggesting I'd been researching how to manipulate elderly people. But he made a crucial mistake. The security cameras I'd installed captured everything, including him entering through the back door with lock-picking tools and planting fake evidence throughout the apartment. The footage showed him placing forged documents in Grandma's desk, doctored photos suggesting I'd isolated her from family, even medication bottles with altered dates to imply I'd been drugging her. His plan was sophisticated but fundamentally flawed. He assumed I was too grief-stricken and naive to protect myself properly. He underestimated the quiet bookworm who'd learned to be resourceful through years of caregiving. I compiled everything: security footage, phone records, witness statements from bookstore customers he'd harassed, documentation of his illegal access to medical records, a complete picture of systematic stalking and evidence tampering. The confrontation happened when he broke in again, this time to plant what looked like a forged will naming him as the primary beneficiary. He thought he was being clever, creating evidence of my alleged fraud. Instead, he walked into my living room to find me sitting calmly with a laptop, showing him on camera picking the lock. Behind me sat my attorney, a police detective, and a representative from the state bar investigating his wife's access to protected medical information. Marcus tried to run but was arrested before he reached his car. The fake will he'd brought was still in his jacket pocket, along with lock-picking tools and a USB drive containing more planted evidence. The search of his house revealed months of planning, detailed timelines of Grandma's medical appointments, research into inheritance law, even a burner phone used to make anonymous calls claiming I was abusing elderly patients at work. His wife lost her medical license for the HIPAA violations. Marcus faced charges for breaking and entering, stalking, evidence tampering, and attempted fraud. His real estate license was suspended pending investigation. The will contest he'd threatened became impossible to file. No lawyer would represent someone facing criminal charges for evidence tampering in the same case. His credibility was destroyed completely. But the real victory came when other family members learned the truth. Marcus had always been their golden boy, but seeing the lengths he'd gone to steal my inheritance opened their eyes. His own parents were horrified. They'd believed his story about me manipulating Grandma, but the security footage of him planting evidence was undeniable. They apologized tearfully and cut contact with him entirely. The bookstore became my healing sanctuary. Regular customers shared memories of Grandma, and I slowly began reopening it part-time. The community rallied around me once word spread about what Marcus had attempted. 6 months later, Marcus pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He got 2 years probation and had to pay restitution for my legal fees and the security system installation. The judge called his behavior a disgraceful violation of family trust. His marriage didn't survive the scandal. His wife blamed him for destroying her career, and their divorce was messy and public. He lost half his assets and had to sell his business to pay legal fees. Meanwhile, I used part of Grandma's inheritance to modernize the bookstore, added a coffee shop, expanded the children's section, created reading groups for seniors, everything she would have loved. The apartment above became my peaceful sanctuary, filled with her books and memories, but no longer haunted by Marcus's presence. I'd found my own version of home. A year later, Marcus sent a letter from rehab. He was dealing with gambling addiction that had apparently motivated his desperate grab for the inheritance. His apology felt genuine, but came too late for forgiveness. I donated the letter to my therapist's office without reading it completely. Some bridges burn so thoroughly that rebuilding isn't worth the effort. Some family members forfeit their place through their own choices. The bookstore thrived beyond anything I'd imagined. Grandma's legacy lived on through story time for children, book clubs for seniors, and a scholarship fund for young readers. The inheritance built something meaningful. Marcus occasionally drove past, never stopping but visible in his beat-up car. His real estate empire had crumbled, and he was working as a night security guard. The golden boy had lost his shine completely. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness for what greed and entitlement had cost him. He'd destroyed his own life trying to steal mine. The inheritance he'd coveted had become his curse. 2 years post-conviction, I met David at a book club meeting. He was recently divorced, looking for community and new connections. We bonded over mystery novels and shared experiences with difficult family situations. David had his own inheritance story involving siblings who'd contested their father's will out of spite rather than need. He understood the violation of having family members question your integrity over money. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, rather than convenience or desperation. He loved the bookstore and often helped with events, never trying to change or control anything. When David proposed, he did it in the children's section, surrounded by the books Grandma and I had read together. Said he wanted to build a life that honored both our pasts while creating something new. Marcus wasn't invited to the wedding, obviously. Most family members respected that decision, though a few relatives tried to pressure me into reconciliation. They didn't understand that some betrayals cut too deep for healing. The marriage was small and perfect, held in the bookstore's garden with customers who'd become friends over the years. Grandma's favorite roses bloomed around us as we exchanged vows. 3 years after Grandma's death, the bookstore had tripled its revenue and become a community cornerstone. I'd proven her faith in me was justified, that her inheritance had been invested wisely in something lasting. Marcus had filed for bankruptcy and moved to another state. His parents occasionally sent updates, hoping I'd soften toward him eventually. But trust, once broken by such calculated betrayal, couldn't be rebuilt with apologies. The apartment above the store became our first home as newlyweds. David understood the significance of the space and never pushed to move somewhere without memories. He helped create new traditions while respecting old ones. 5 years later, we welcomed our daughter Rose, named for the grandmother she'd never meet, but whose love shaped every corner of her future home. The bookstore would be her inheritance someday. I often wondered if Marcus knew about his great niece, if he regretted the relationships his greed had cost him, but those questions belonged to him now. My focus was on building, rather than destroying. The security cameras were long gone, replaced by trust and community community connections. The bookstore felt safe again, filled with laughter and learning rather than fear and surveillance. Sometimes customers asked about the family drama they'd witnessed years earlier. I'd smile and redirect them to book recommendations. The past had its place, but it didn't define the present. Marcus's cautionary tale became local legend, whispered among business owners about the dangers of entitlement and the importance of appreciating what you have rather than coveting what others receive. His name was Mud in Portland's small business community, the real estate agent who'd tried to steal his grandmother's inheritance through fraud and intimidation, a reputation that followed him everywhere. Meanwhile, my name became associated with community service, literary education, and honoring elderly wisdom. The bookstore won awards for cultural contribution and small business excellence. 10 years after Grandma's death, I could finally think about Marcus without anger. Not forgiveness exactly, but a sort of sad acceptance that some people destroy themselves through their own choices. The inheritance he'd tried so desperately to steal had grown into something far more valuable than money. Community, purpose, family legacy, genuine love, things that couldn't be taken by force or fraud. Rose toddled between bookshelves, playing with customers who'd known her grandmother and great-grandmother. 3 generations of women connected through stories and stubborn independence. David and I had expanded into a second location, hiring former customers who'd become friends. The business model was built on relationship rather than pure profit, something Grandma would have appreciated. Marcus sent a card when Rose was born, forwarded through his parents. I threw it away without opening it. Some gestures come too late and from too hollow a place to matter. The bookstore's success attracted attention from larger chains wanting to buy us out. We declined every offer, preferring to remain independent and community-focused. Money couldn't buy the relationships we'd built. 15 years later, Rose was reading chapter books and helping customers find their next favorite story. She had Grandma's love of literature and my stubborn determination to protect what mattered most. Marcus had remarried and moved to Ohio. According to Christmas cards his parents still sent hopefully. I was glad he'd found some peace, but felt no need to reconnect or offer forgiveness. The apartment above the store had been converted into a small event space for author readings and book launches. Every gathering honored Grandma's memory while celebrating new voices and stories. My inheritance had multiplied in ways Marcus could never have imagined, not just financially, but culturally and emotionally. The quiet bookworm had built something extraordinary from what he'd tried to steal. The security system I'd installed to catch him had been removed years ago, replaced by open doors and welcoming signs. Trust restored through time and community investment. Sometimes I'd find old photos of family gatherings with Marcus smiling and charming, before greed transformed him into a stranger. Those images reminded me that people could change in terrible ways. But mostly I focused forward, on Rose's education, David's happiness, and the bookstore's continued growth. The inheritance thief had become ancient history, relevant only as a cautionary tale. 20 years after Grandma's death, the bookstore had become a Portland landmark. Tour groups included it on literary walking tours. Travel magazines featured it in articles about charming independent shops. Marcus would be in his 50s now, maybe wondering how different his life could have been if he'd simply accepted Grandma's decision with grace. But those questions belonged to him alone. I'd built exactly the kind of legacy Grandma had hoped for when she left me her inheritance. Not just financial security, but purpose, community, and the chance to make a difference through books and stories. The quiet girl who'd read to her grandmother had become a businesswoman, community leader, and mother. The inheritance Marcus tried to steal had been invested in everything that truly mattered. Rose would inherit not just money and property, but relationships, reputation, and the knowledge that family loyalty is earned through actions, not assumed through blood relations. The bookstore would continue for another generation, carrying Grandma's love of stories into a future Marcus had forfeited through his own choices. That was the best inheritance of all. 25 years after Grandma's death, I received a phone call that brought everything full circle. The caller identified herself as Detective Maria Santos, working a cold case involving Marcus and several other inheritance fraud schemes. Apparently, my situation hadn't been Marcus's first attempt at stealing family money. The detective had uncovered a pattern going back to college, where he'd manipulated elderly relatives and family friends into changing their wills through similar tactics. The investigation started when Marcus's second wife discovered evidence that he'd convinced her grandmother to leave him money shortly before she died. She'd found the same type of planted evidence, forged documents, and suspicious medical record access. Detective Santos explained that Marcus had perfected his system over decades. Target elderly relatives, research their medical conditions, gain access to their homes, plant evidence of manipulation by other family members, then swoop in as the concerned relative fighting for justice. My case had been his most elaborate attempt because the stakes were highest. Grandma's estate was worth significantly more than his previous targets. When it failed so spectacularly, he'd apparently given up the scheme entirely. But the detective was building cases against him for at least 6 other incidents. Families across 3 states who'd lost inheritances to his manipulations. Elderly people who'd died confused about why their relatives suddenly seemed untrustworthy. The evidence I'd preserved from my security system became crucial to these other cases. The footage showing his lock-picking skills, evidence-planting techniques, and methodical approach proved he'd been operating as a professional inheritance thief. Rose, now 20 and studying business at Portland State, was fascinated by the investigation. investigation. She'd grown up knowing the basic story, but was amazed to learn about the broader pattern of her great-uncle's crimes. The detective asked if I'd be willing to testify in the new cases. Several elderly victims had died without ever learning the truth about how their families had been torn apart by Marcus's lies. I agreed immediately. After building a life of meaning from Grandma's inheritance, I owed it to other families to help expose the truth about what Marcus had done to them. The trial made national news. The Inheritance Thief: How One Man Destroyed Families for Decades became a true crime documentary that aired on Netflix. They interviewed me extensively about my experience. Sitting in that documentary studio, explaining how I'd caught Marcus through security cameras and patient investigation, I realized how much I'd grown since that frightened young woman defending her grandmother's final wishes. The bookstore had become my platform for advocacy. I started hosting workshops for families dealing with inheritance disputes, teaching them how to protect elderly relatives from manipulation and document everything properly. Legal experts began referring clients to me when they suspected inheritance fraud. My experience with Marcus had given me unique insight into how these schemes operated and how to build cases against them. The workshops grew into a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing elder financial abuse. We provided resources, legal referrals, and emotional support for families torn apart by inheritance thieves. Marcus received an additional 15 years when the full scope of his crimes was revealed. The judge called him a predator who'd weaponized family relationships for financial gain across multiple decades. His victims' families finally got answers about why their loved ones' final years had been filled with suspicion and conflict. Many had blamed themselves for not recognizing the manipulation sooner. The documentary sparked conversations about inheritance law reform and better protections for elderly people. Several states strengthened their requirements for will changes and medical record access. Rose decided to study law after watching the trial proceedings. She wanted to specialize in elder law and continue the work I'd started through the nonprofit, the next generation carrying forward the mission. David and I were invited to speak at legal conferences about recognizing and preventing inheritance fraud. Our story became a case study in law schools, teaching courses on elder abuse and financial crimes. The bookstore celebrated its 30th anniversary under my ownership with a community festival. Hundreds of customers, 3 generations of families, local authors, and city officials gathered to celebrate what Grandma's legacy had become. During my speech that day, I mentioned that the inheritance one person had tried to steal had grown into something that served thousands of people. That community investment was the best security against any future threats. Marcus sent a letter from prison on the anniversary, supposedly apologizing for everything and asking to meet Rose before he died. I showed the letter to David and Rose, then we decided together to decline. Some relationships are too poisoned by betrayal to ever heal safely. Marcus had proven through decades of crimes that he viewed family as resources to exploit rather than people to love. The nonprofit expanded internationally, partnering with organizations in Europe and Australia, dealing with similar inheritance fraud patterns. My grandmother's bookstore in Portland had become the headquarters for a global movement. Rose graduated law school with honors and immediately joined the nonprofit as our legal director. Watching her argue cases in court, protecting elderly people from financial predators, filled me with the same pride Grandma had felt watching me care for others. 30 years after the original trial, Marcus died in prison. His obituary mentioned that he was survived by distant relatives who declined to claim his body. The golden boy who'd once charmed everyone had died completely alone. I felt no satisfaction in his death, only sadness for all the relationships he'd destroyed through his greed. Dozens of families had been torn apart by his schemes. Countless elderly people had died feeling betrayed by loved ones who'd actually been manipulated. The documentary about his crimes won an Emmy for Outstanding Investigative Journalism. The acceptance speech focused on the importance of protecting vulnerable elderly people and recognizing the warning signs of financial abuse. Rose married a fellow lawyer who specialized in disability rights. Their wedding was held in the bookstore's garden, surrounded by the same roses that had bloomed during my own ceremony decades earlier. The 4th generation was represented by their twin daughters, who spent afternoons playing among the bookshelves while their parents worked on legal cases upstairs. The inheritance Marcus had tried to steal continued growing through love and community service. 40 years after Grandma's death, the bookstore had helped save dozens of families from inheritance fraud through our education programs. We'd turned Marcus's crimes into a force for protecting others from similar predators. The original apartment above the store became a museum showcasing the history of our work and the importance of family legacy built through service rather than selfishness. School groups visited regularly to learn about elder abuse prevention. Rose's daughters were already showing signs of inheriting the family's determination to protect vulnerable people. They volunteered at senior centers, reading to elderly residents just as I'd once read to Grandma. The security cameras that had once been necessary to catch Marcus were now purely for business insurance. The bookstore operated on trust and community connection, the way Grandma had always intended. Looking back, I realized that Marcus's attempt to steal my inheritance had actually multiplied its value exponentially. His greed had forced me to become stronger, smarter, and more determined to use wealth responsibly. The quiet bookworm who'd once hidden behind novels had become a nationally recognized advocate, best-selling author, and founder of an organization that protected thousands of elderly people annually. Grandma's motto modest inheritance had grown into a legacy worth millions in community impact. The bookstore, the nonprofit, the educational programs, the legal precedents we'd established all flowed from her original gift of trust and responsibility. Marcus had seen only money when he looked at that inheritance. I'd seen responsibility, opportunity, and the chance to honor someone who'd given me everything when I had nothing. The difference in our perspectives had determined not just who deserved the inheritance, but what that inheritance would become. Greed destroys, while gratitude builds something lasting. 50 years after Grandma's death, Rose stood where I once had, reading her grandmother's will to her own daughters. The tradition of women protecting and empowering each other continued into another generation. The bookstore had become a Portland institution, protected by historical designation and community love. No amount of money could buy what generations of relationships had built through trust and service. Marcus had been forgotten except as a cautionary tale in our family history. The inheritance thief who'd tried to steal love but had only succeeded in proving that real wealth comes from the lives you touch, not the money you accumulate. The final chapter of this story wasn't about revenge or justice served. It was about transformation, about turning attempted theft into lasting good, about proving that the best inheritance is the wisdom to use whatever you receive in service of others. Grandma's bookstore would continue indefinitely, owned by women who understood that inheritance is responsibility, that wealth is meant to serve community, and that the most valuable things in life can never be stolen because they exist in relationships built through decades of trust. The inheritance Marcus coveted had become something far greater than he could have imagined. Not just money or property, but a legacy of protection, advocacy, and love that would outlast any individual fortune. That was the inheritance that truly mattered. The one that grew through sharing rather than hoarding, that multiplied through service rather than selfishness, that could never be stolen because it lived in the hearts of everyone it had touched. And in the end, that was worth infinitely more than anything Marcus had ever tried to take. 60 years after Grandma's death, I stood in the Rose Memorial Library, the newest addition to our campus that had grown from a single bookstore into a complex serving the entire Pacific Northwest. At 96, I moved slowly, but my mind remained sharp, focused on the speech I was about to give. The auditorium was packed with law students, social workers, family lawyers, and advocates from around the world. This was the annual Marcus Prevention Conference, named ironically after the man whose crimes had sparked a global movement to protect elderly people from financial abuse. Rose, now in her 50s and a federal judge specializing in elder law, introduced me with tears in her eyes. She spoke about how her great-grandmother's simple bookstore had evolved into an institution that had saved thousands of families from the kind of destruction Marcus had attempted. As I approached the podium, I thought about how many lives had been changed by one man's greed and one woman's determination to transform that greed into something meaningful. The butterfly effect of Marcus's betrayal had rippled across decades and continents. The conference had attracted attendees from 47 countries. Inheritance fraud was apparently a global problem, but so was the resistance movement that had grown from our small Portland bookstore into an international network of protection and prevention. My speech focused on the upcoming legislation that Rose had helped draft, comprehensive federal protections for elderly people that would make Marcus-style schemes nearly impossible to execute. The bill was expected to pass unanimously, supported by both parties who'd finally recognized elder abuse as a bipartisan issue. During the question period, a young lawyer from South Korea explained how our training materials had helped her prevent an inheritance fraud scheme targeting her own grandmother. The same techniques Marcus had used were being employed worldwide, but so were our countermeasures. After the conference, Rose and I walked slowly through the memorial garden behind the library. Every plant had been chosen to honor a specific victim of inheritance fraud, families who'd reached out over the decades to share their stories and find healing through our community. Marcus's grave marker was visible from the garden, a simple stone in the prison cemetery where he'd been buried 60 years earlier. We'd had it placed there as a reminder that every choice has consequences, that betrayal ultimately destroys the betrayer more than the betrayed. The newest addition to our complex was the Marcus Prevention Training Center, where law enforcement officers, social workers, and family members learned to recognize the warning signs of inheritance manipulation. The irony of using his name to prevent his crimes wasn't lost on anyone. Rose's daughters, now successful attorneys themselves, had expanded our work into digital fraud prevention. As technology advanced, so did the methods inheritance thieves used to manipulate elderly people and their families. The bookstore itself had been preserved exactly as Grandma had left it, down to the original cash register and handwritten inventory cards. It served as the heart of our complex, reminding everyone that this movement had grown from simple values: love, care, and respect for elderly wisdom. Visiting dignitaries always asked to see the apartment where I'd lived when Marcus was stalking me, where the security cameras had captured his evidence-planting schemes. The rooms had been converted into a permanent exhibit showing how one person's courage to document abuse could change history. The original security footage was displayed on a loop, showing Marcus picking locks and planting fake evidence. Law enforcement agencies worldwide used it as training material, teaching officers how sophisticated inheritance fraud could become. On my 97th birthday, the mayor of Portland declared it Rachel Henderson Day, honoring not just my individual story, but the thousands of people who joined our movement over the decades. The proclamation noted said that our organization had prevented an estimated $2.8 billion in inheritance fraud globally. The celebration was held in Pioneer Courthouse Square, with speakers including Rose, the governor, and representatives from our international partner organizations. Seeing thousands of people gathered to honor work that had grown from Grandma's simple inheritance was overwhelming. During my remarks, I pointed out that Marcus had succeeded in one way he'd never intended. He'd created a legacy that would last far longer than any inheritance he could have stolen. His crimes had accidentally built something eternal. The documentary about our work had been updated multiple times over the decades, each version including new cases we'd helped solve and new legislation we'd helped pass. The most recent version won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Universities had established entire academic programs based on our research into inheritance fraud patterns. The Marcus Henderson Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School was considered the world's leading authority on elder financial abuse prevention. At 98, I published my final book, The Inheritance Guardian: A Century of Protecting Family Legacy. It became an immediate bestseller, with proceeds funding scholarships for law students specializing in elder protection. The book tour was conducted virtually from the library's conference room, but the audience was global. People from every continent shared their own stories of inheritance fraud and how our resources had helped them protect their families. Rose had been appointed to the Supreme Court the previous year, the first justice to specialize in elder law. Her confirmation hearings included extensive discussion of our family's work and how personal experience had shaped her judicial philosophy. During her swearing-in ceremony, Rose mentioned that justice sometimes begins with one person refusing to accept injustice, even when that person is just a grieving granddaughter defending her inheritance against a greedy cousin. The complex had grown to include a law school, a research institute, a training academy for social workers, and a publishing house that produced materials in 37 languages. What had started as Marcus's attempt to steal $200,000 had become a billion-dollar institution. On my 99th birthday, Rose announced the establishment of the Rachel Henderson Endowment, funded by donations from families we'd helped over the decades. The endowment would ensure our work continued indefinitely, regardless of economic changes or political shifts. The celebration was broadcast globally, with watch parties held in cities where our international partners operated. Seeing elderly people from around the world raising glasses to toast Grandma's inheritance and the movement it had inspired was deeply moving. As I approached my 100th birthday, reporters frequently asked if I had any regrets about how I'd handled Marcus's stalking and fraud attempts. The answer was always the same. My only regret was that it had taken a criminal conspiracy to reveal how widespread inheritance abuse actually was. The centennial celebration was planned for the bookstore itself, limited to family and the closest collaborators who'd built this movement over 7 decades. Rose's great-granddaughters, representing the 6th generation of women in our family, would cut the ceremonial cake. Looking back across a century of life, 65 years of which had been shaped by Marcus's attempted theft, I realized that his greed had accidentally created something far more valuable than money, a global network of protection that would outlast any individual fortune. The quiet bookworm who'd once hidden behind novels had become a centenarian whose work was studied in universities worldwide, whose methods were used by law enforcement agencies on every continent, whose legacy would protect families for generations to come. Marcus had tried to steal an inheritance worth $200,000. Instead, he'd forced the creation of an institution worth billions in social impact, legal precedent, and prevented abuse. The irony was so complete, it felt like cosmic justice. At my 100th birthday party, surrounded by 5 generations of family and colleagues from around the world, I offered a final toast to Marcus. Not in forgiveness, but in gratitude for accidentally proving that the most valuable inheritance is wisdom, that the greatest wealth is community, and that the best revenge is building something beautiful from attempted destruction. The inheritance thief had failed to steal anything meaningful. Instead, he'd become the unwitting founder of a movement that had saved thousands of families from his own type of predatory behavior. History would remember him only as the catalyst for something far greater than his crimes. Grandma's simple bookstore inheritance had grown into an empire of protection, spanning continents and decades. The love she'd invested in one granddaughter had multiplied exponentially, touching lives she could never have imagined. And as I prepared to join her, I knew that inheritance, the real inheritance of love, service, and protection, would continue growing long after both Marcus and I were forgotten. That was the true victory, the lasting legacy, the inheritance that could never be stolen because it lived in the hearts and actions of everyone it had touched. The bookworm had won, not through revenge or retaliation, but through transformation. Marcus's greed had accidentally built something eternal, and for that unintended gift, history would remember him not as a thief, but as the inadvertent architect of justice.